When you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. That's what medical students are taught. It just means that the correct diagnosis is usually the most common one, not the rarest. So don't waste your time. But what if it is a zebra? In the past, autism was thought to occur in about 1 in 10,000 people. It was a zebra diagnosis. Now we know that the numbers are closer to 1 in 36. Oh, full disclosure, I'm not autistic. But I have known hundreds of autistic folk, students, clients, colleagues, friends and family, including my husband. So what is autism? Well, it's a neurodevelopmental condition. Neuro meaning brain, and developmental meaning that it's present since childhood. That's important. We'll put a pin in that and get back to it later. Many people think that autism only affects boys, not girls. But more and more girls are being recognized as autistic. Another misconception is that autism is a childhood condition, that it only affects young children. So would autism in an adult woman be a zebra diagnosis? We certainly used to think so. But we're learning it's not as rare as we thought. Let's talk about what it means to be autistic. Is it a disability or just a difference? Well, is a zebra disabled? If it's on a ranch with horses, it might seem disabled. It can't carry a rider. Well, not safely. But in the wild plains with other zebras, that is not a problem. Having a different brain or being neurodivergent is not a disability in my book. Although technically it is a disability in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. But in the natural world, there are many different kinds of brains or neurotypes, and many ways of communicating, of relating to the sensory and social world, many ways of thinking and of solving problems. Now, some people can solve problems by thinking outside the box, standing next to the box in the same room. That's a good skill. But I know autistic folk who can think around the corner and 2 blocks down from the box. They notice patterns and details that no one else sees. That's a valuable skill. When you're in the minority, though, different can feel disabling. The majority makes up the unwritten rules we live by. For instance, I like to look at people's eyes when we talk. Therefore, everyone should look at my eyes. If you don't, I can't trust you. Many autistic folk find that looking right at someone's eyeballs is uncomfortable. When they look away from the speaker, they can focus on the words, not the visual distractions. This is labeled a symptom of autism, but it could just as easily be called a personal preference that happens to be in the minority in some cultures. Autistic people are also considered disabled in communication. In one study, researchers put typical people together and gave them communication tasks. They had no problems. They gave the same tasks to a group of autistic people. Still, no problems. It was only when they put the 2 groups together that communication problems showed up. In most workplaces and families, there's a mix of neurodivergent and neuromajority people. Guess who gets blamed for any miscommunications? Spoiler alert, it's not the majority. Unfortunately, most of the burden of trying to cross the gap and change their communication style is placed on the autistic folk. Most typical people believe that their way of communicating is correct, so they don't try to change. They expect the autistic person to take full responsibility for any communication problems. That hardly seems fair, does it? Oh, I am not trying to shame or blame people in the neuromajority. I'm one myself. But we all tend to do the best we can with the information we have, and most people still don't know much about autistic communication styles. Early in my career, I used to think we should teach autistic girls and boys to act more like their typical peers so they could be accepted. I see now that I should have been teaching everyone else to accept children who seem different. As the poet Maya Angelou said, do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. Now, I know better. There's nothing wrong with having a unique or different style. No one should teach an autistic person to be just like everyone else at the expense of being themselves. In this century, I hope, we no longer tell gay people to stay in the closet or tell black people to lighten their skin and straighten their hair if they want to get in college or get a good job or buy a house. These are things that used to happen in our society, but now I hope we know better. There is nothing wrong with looking, loving, or acting different from the norm. There's nothing wrong with being autistic, just as there's nothing wrong with zebras. Different is not worse. It's not better. It's just different. Many of us, in the majority, are learning to adapt our own expectations and responses rather than expecting others to always change who they are to be more like us. Now, let's get back to that developmental piece of the diagnosis. The DSM states that the symptoms of autism must be present in childhood, but they may not have been recognized. So how did all these late diagnosed autistic women make it through school without ever being identified? Camouflage. Zebras have their stripes, and late diagnosed autistic women have their masks. They often create these masks when they start school. They observe that the other girls seem to play together and make friends naturally with no rule book. An autistic girl can be quite good at observing and imitating her peers in hopes of blending in with the crowd and being accepted. Soon she realizes that other girls don't flap their hands when they're upset, and they don't repetitively bounce up and down when they're happy. She tries to change her own behavior, clasping her hands tightly together instead of flapping, and tapping a foot rather than bouncing. For every movement that is seen as odd, she finds a subtle substitute. She may bite the insides of her cheeks or tap her fingertips together, but down at her side to escape notice. Over time, she learns to stop acting like herself and start masking, pretending to be the typical little girl that everyone expects. She may not even realize she's masking. It can start as a survival strategy and then become a way of life. An autistic girl may believe that everyone experiences the world as she does, that we all feel intense pain every time the school bell rings, but that everyone else is stronger than she is. They can all keep working through the pain. After decades of masking, she's exhausted. She's been working twice as hard to appear normal, and it takes a toll, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Finally, she's done. She's tired of camouflaging. She's ready to find out why she feels so different from everyone else. Shonda Kay was diagnosed as autistic when she was 51 years old. She had this to say: "Learning about autism started my journey of discovery into why I am the way I am. When I shared my diagnosis with my mother, she asked me what I intended to gain from this knowledge. I thought, that's a really good question. There is no magic pill or cure for autism, nor should there be. Everyone is wired uniquely for themselves, and I am no different. I am not flawed, nor do I have a deficit. I just approach things in my own way. I guess what I hope most to gain from my diagnosis is acceptance. Acceptance from myself most of all. I don't have to be like everyone else to be included and to be loved. I, in all my glorious and not so glorious quirkiness, am deserving of a happy and healthy life." Shonda Kay spent decades thinking she was the problem, when in fact, she just had a different kind of brain. Once she learned she was autistic, she began to love who she was and to quit trying to be like everyone else. Was a late diagnosis worth it? It was for Shonda Kay and for many other women like her. When you're a zebra living with horses, life is hard. You might feel like a failure, a weird horse. Wouldn't it be wonderful to realize that you're not failing at being a horse? In fact, you're a perfect zebra. But until you know for sure that you are a zebra, not a striped horse, you may worry that you're faking being a zebra, just as you tried to fake being a horse. Having a diagnosis, or self-identifying, learning at last that you are truly a zebra, or that you're actually autistic, is a huge relief. You belong. That doesn't mean you'll never hang out with horses. Of course you will. Horses are great. And we can't all be zebras. But knowing who you are is empowering. Not every hoofbeat is a horse. Zebras do exist, and so do autistic women. Now, I promised you swans, so let's talk about swans. We all know Hans Christian Andersen's story of the ugly duckling. The real problem, though, wasn't that she needed to grow up so she could become the magnificent swan that she was. No, the problem was entirely environmental. She didn't have a disability. She was hatched as a perfectly normal cygnet. It was being in the wrong nest with ducks instead of her own family that handicapped her. Had she grown up surrounded by other cygnets and swans, there would have been no ugly awkwardness, no rejection, only a sense of belonging. Autistic women can also find a sense of belonging when they connect with other folk like themselves. Many women who believe they are autistic and seek diagnosis, or who self-identify as autistic, are asked, "Why do you care? You turned out okay, so it doesn't matter if you're autistic or not." Well, Shonda Kay and many others would strongly disagree. Knowing that you're autistic, that you have a unique and valuable brain, but that you process the world differently from the majority, is a game changer. But what about you? Why should you care? Well, if you have a friend or family member who tells you that she's autistic, I hope you'll believe her. Whether she's formally diagnosed or self-identified, believe her. Accept her as she is. Be patient with her differences and value her unique way of looking at the world. We are all richer for the diversity of our melting pot. If you yourself have masked your autistic traits since childhood, pretending to be normal, a diagnosis or self-identification can mean the world. Finally, rather than trying so hard to hide who you are, you can choose to let down your mask and be yourself. You're not failing at being human. You're amazing while autistic. Knowing that they're autistic, many women, just like you, learn to forgive themselves for all the years that they failed to live up to typical expectations. They learn to forgive others for not understanding what they didn't know, and for offering criticism when what was needed was grace. Identifying as autistic late in life means you'll know yourself better. And once you know better, you and everyone in your life can do better. Swans need their flocks. Zebras need their herds. And late diagnosed autistic women need acceptance and community. My wish for all of us is that we can know and love who we are, zebras, swans, that each of us finds our place to belong in the world, because there is strength in knowing there's nothing wrong with you. You've just been autistic all along. Congratulations.